Thanks, Karen. This is Sarah Nordoff, and I'm going to kick things off in the presentation today and then hand it over to my colleague, Mary Brown. First of all, let me just give you a sense of what we're going to cover in today's webinar. We will have time at the end for questions, so do be thinking about what you'd like to ask us more specifically about our process. We're going to talk a bit about the evolution of our re-enrollment process, which has changed a lot in the last 3 or so years. I will walk through how that evolution worked, going from paper contracts to what we do now, which is simply an email to current families, and then what we changed with our billing process. And then I'll turn it over to Mary to talk more specifically about some of the positive outcomes of what we learned went through the process. And we would encourage everyone at the end, if you have, during the Q&A, if you have best practices that you'd like to share with us, we're happy to relay that to the audience as well. This is Mary's slide. A little bit of humor, which I know we could all use at this time of year. We're starting to get into that tough season of both recruiting and starting to evaluate applications. So hopefully everyone can relate with this. So let me give you a little bit of context for who we are as a school and what our team looks like. I think it's helpful as you think about your own re-enrollment process and the resources that you have at hand and what kind of school you are and how we did that based on who we are. So Catlin Gables in Portland, Oregon. We have about 700, almost 760 students who study here as a day school from pre-K through grade 12. Our campus is about 60 acres. We're a secular coeducational school. About 34% of our students are students of color. Our financial aid budget is around $3.5 million, and around, therefore, 27% of our population receive financial assistance to attend. And our tuition ranges from around 20 grand to about 27 grand from pre-K to the upper school. Our team consists of a director, an associate director who oversees our beginning and lower school admission, an assistant director who oversees our middle school admission, and then we have a data coordinator who manages our online application and all of our data reporting, an admission and financial aid coordinator, and then an admission associate who oversees our middle and upper school visits, and beginning and lower school actually too, and all of our events. So a good-sized team. Our re-enrollment process when Mary and I first got here was paper re-enrollment. So we had large contracts that we would collate and send out to families that detailed their re-enrollment deposits, their tuition insurance, and as I know a lot of you experience right now, it was a fairly labor-intensive process. Families had to receive those contracts through the mail, sign them, return them to us via snail mail at that time, along with their deposit. And the re-enrollment was not counted actually until we received that deposit. So a process that took many weeks and many hours of labor to do. And we found ourselves throughout the springtime often going after families who had not sent in all of the documentation and or the deposit that we needed to really count them in re-enrollment. So as we were trying to nail down new enrollment, we were still wrestling with who was formally re-enrolled. So not perfect. We then quickly went towards more of an online re-enrollment process. And we did that using a system called DocuSign, which is, if you're not familiar, is largely a software that companies use for things like mortgage signing or signing of legal documents. Not free, but not as expensive as some of the more formal admission software that have re-enrollment modules with them. So with this process, through DocuSign, we emailed families their contracts. And they then could sign via the DocuSign system the contracts and then send it back to us. So it was more expedient in the sense that it was through emails. We weren't having to use snail mail. We were still, though, having to track down DocuSign documents that had not been returned. And of course, the deposits, unless they had an ACH account, also came through the mail to our business office. So an improvement for sure, but still quite a lot of time on our part spent towards trying to track down the online re-enrollments that had not come through yet. And so this past year, we went towards really more of an automatic re-enrollment process. And what we did for that was to send an email to families that essentially said, you are re-enrolled unless we hear otherwise from you. We did this because we wanted to have a more streamlined process for parents. We felt that this was a school that committed to families year to year. So we wanted to have a process that represented that we would assume that they would be coming back, and that was sort of the community building message that we wanted to have. We certainly wanted to save resources, and also given that the majority of our families did re-enroll, our attrition rate at Catlin is around 3 to 4%. That it just didn't make sense to have this labor-intensive process for something that was really automatically happening anyway. We also wanted some more time to manage some of the exceptions, some of the academic holds or AR holds or families that for whatever reason we needed to work out the parameters of their re-enrollment. This would allow us to do so. So the timeline for this process was in September. We talked with our business office and the senior administration, so division heads, head of school, CFO, etc., to get their sense of what would be the pros and cons of doing this. Everybody thought it was a good idea, but we wanted to be sure that everybody was on board. If families had questions, we needed to have this be a school commitment towards going towards this process, not just something that admissions wanted to do. We also floated the idea past a small group of parents, so really to get a sense from the user end of how might this feel to have more of an automatic re-enrollment process from their end. Would that be okay? And their feedback was quite positive. In November, we worked on our email communication and our timeline of how we would roll this out to families. So we spent a lot of time up in these first few months of the fall and really thinking about the rollout of this process and preparing for it and trying to think about all of the ways in which this might not go well so that we could preempt those up front. In early December, we sent a heads-up email to all of our families. And in that, we told them about this change in process, that they would be getting an email in January that would essentially be their re-enrollment contract. So we wanted to kind of grease the skids with our current families so that they would understand that this is going to be different, but the commitment in terms of their re-enrollment to the school was going to be the same as it would be if they were signing a contract. In early January, we sent a customized email to all of our families, and this was the sort of formal contract email that was in lieu of a re-enrollment contract. So in that email, we detailed what their payment option had been in the past, and then if it was going to change, to let us know. Similarly with tuition insurance, what they had chosen in the past, and to let us know if that was going to change. We then sent out January statements right after that email went out from the business office, and that included the billing for the re-enrollment deposit. And we told them that we would be doing that in the emails that went out in both December and January, that that's sort of how things would go. That they would simply be billed for the deposit, and to let us know by February 1st if indeed they were not planning to re-enroll, and we would remove the deposit from their billing statement. For Catlin Gable, our tuition is not decided until the first Board of Trustee meeting of that year. And for us, that's usually the first week or two of January. So our Finance Committee proposes what the tuition will be in December, and then it's voted upon at the January meeting for the board. So we could not tell families what the tuition would be. So we based our re-enrollment deposit, which is for Catlin 10% of the tuition for the next year. We just based it on what the previous year had been, knowing that it's not going to change by a dramatic amount, and it would be fine in terms of money's committed towards coming for the next year. But we did, right after that board meeting, email families from the head of school confirming what tuition would be. So they had that information before they had to actually tell us by that February 1st deadline of whether or not they were planning to not re-enroll. After that February 1st deadline passed, we sent an email confirmation to all of our families letting them know, congratulations, you're now re-enrolled at the school. The business office did follow up on deposits at that point, but the vast majority of our families had deposited, and since they didn't have to sign a contract, on our end the paperwork was really done. We, in early March, then sent out our new families re-enrollment or new enrollment contracts. And we do use a system called EchoSign and send a formal contract to new families. And so in that new contract, the language details that this is sort of the contract that you will sign that will serve in perpetuity for your time here at Catlin. So that was the timeline. We also made some changes to our billing cycle. Given that we were making these changes to the re-enrollment process, we figured it was a good time to rethink how we were and when we were billing families. We, as I mentioned, made the re-enrollment deposit due February 1st. And we adjusted things a little bit so that families paying in installments would owe somewhat of a larger percentage of their tuition earlier in the process. So they'd be on the hook for more around 40% by June versus the typical 20% which we had had in the past. The reason for that was that it just gave us a better sense of if families are going to be struggling with those payments going forward, or if they're actually not fully committed to coming back the next year, we could head those issues off earlier in the spring and summertime versus trying to manage them in August when we are, in our old system, the 40% was typically due. So that worked well for us in terms of also not having as much summer melt and being able to go to the wait pool much earlier and grabbing some of those great families to come in sooner in the process. Okay, I am now going to turn it over to my colleague Mary, and she'll talk about some of the positive outcomes of these changes.
So the entire process went more smoothly and more positively than we could have ever imagined. Some outcome, and certainly by far most, or if not all, of the outcomes matched what our goals were for making the change. So first and foremost, it certainly saved the admission office a lot of time. Our re-enrollment process, of course, is right in the middle of a really busy, hectic time for recruiting and making admission decisions on new students. And so to be able to just save on time and energy by having a more assumed or automated process was a godsend. It also saved the department money. There were no more costs associated with printing, paper contracts, so the paper postage back in the day when we used to mail the re-enrollment contracts, and then of course reprinting contracts for those who needed another copy and so forth. Also, now that we go with a simple email, it also provides us with just immediate delivery to every recipient. There was no longer the waiting and wondering that snail mail that required. So every household received the email at the same time. even if they were not in town or across the world and so forth. It also just took much less time to resend any of the information electronically than, of course, to reprint and resend paper information or the electronic and re-enrollment contract that we had just come from. So all in all, just really allowed us to provide much greater and better customer service. We were so much more able to serve those exceptions that Sarah referred to because the entire process took so much less time and energy. We had done a sample with, or sort of tossed out the idea to some small group of current parents before officially going down this road and got positive comments, as well as some constructive comments, and then when we rolled it out for everybody, by and large, parents and guardians absolutely loved the process. As is true with changing up any process, sometimes questions came about, but truly we were just very pleasantly surprised that families seemed to just really love it and just sort of wonder why we hadn't done it years ago. So that was good news. And then sort of by the end of the cycle, it just we were pleasantly surprised that it took us significantly less time to wrap up our re-enrollment. So the fact that families didn't need to track down their contracts, whether they were paper contracts or electronic contracts, and have each parent, if it was a two-parent household, sign them and return them. The fact that they didn't need to do that when they for sure knew that they were going to re-enroll just saved an incredible amount of time on our end and on families, the family's end. So as Sarah mentioned, when we went from paper contracts to electronic contracts, and now, of course, we only use the electronic enrollment contracts for brand new families. But there was a time where we did a little bit of research on what kind of software to use. So we started out when everybody got either a re-enrollment contract or a new enrollment electronic contract. We use DocuSign, and as Sarah mentioned, that's a software that's used for other types of electronic contracts. And while DocuSign worked fine, we did decide after a year or two of using them to switch to EchoSign. But beyond just sort of the specifics of the actual software used, just some questions to ask. I think if anybody is doing some research on what kind of software to use, if you do decide to go electronic, is just asking the companies about the cost per sort of electronic signature. Each software uses different lingo, but certainly just to be really clear about sort of what the cost for individual contracts or signatures, however they divide it up, it's helpful to know that because the costs, of course, can add up. There are just questions around the signing capabilities. So does the school, can the school dictate sort of which, if you're going to require a two-parent household and require both parents to sign the contract, can we as the school determine which order the contract goes in, and some of those just details that sometimes you just don't think about while you're researching software. Also, what is the ability on the school's end to just track electronic signatures so that you know who has already signed the electronic contract and who hasn't, so that if you need to do any kind of gentle reminders that you're able to track that easily. I think it's also really important to ask about what kind of training or support the software or the vendor provides. Whether or not you anticipate needing it, it's just good to know. Sort of little things pop up, and it's nice to know if they do offer support or what kind of training at the beginning they offer. Questions around just how you export the data that comes in. So if you are using an electronic electronic contract? Are there easy methods to determining quickly through a spreadsheet or other ways, what the percentage of contracts have come in, by what date, and so on and so forth. To kind of clarify in your own minds what questions you want to ask around what kind of reports do you want. And then also just how many users can be on the account that you purchase. So if you have folks from the business office wanting to manage or oversee part of this, as well as folks from the admission office, which is the case at Catlin, just sort of how many users can be on the account, what is the cost, and so on and so forth. Just a few thoughts around partnerships on the campus. It's just really key to get buy-in and assistance from a number of different departments on the campus, which is true, I guess, for really every admission office endeavor. But first and foremost, for us, the partnerships or the conversations started with the IT department, who really helped us out in partnered with us in thinking about what vendors we wanted to go with the electronic re-enrollment contracts. Certainly the business office, and that was true for every re-enrollment endeavor, whether it was paper or electronic or now the more automated re-enrollment, just in terms of timeline for when the deposit is due, and then switching from actually putting the deposit on the January billing statement, and so forth. So conversations from the very beginning happened with the business office and with the IT department. As I mentioned, once we had a draft of how we wanted this plan to work, we tossed the idea out to several parents that were part of, they happened to be representatives of our parent association, thinking that they had influence among other parents, and so we wanted to make sure that they were supportive of our plan, or certainly if they had feedback, that we wanted to hear from them as well. So we felt like that was really a key piece as well as we rolled out this plan. And of course, as Sarah mentioned, senior administrators needed to not only be on board with the plan and supportive of it, but also just be really clear about what it was, because as we all know, questions from parents come not only to the business office or the admission office, they sometimes just come to the division heads or other administrators. So that we're all kind of giving the same message was really key. The communications office was also key for us. We worked with our director of communications in all the language of all the emails that we sent out, from the heads up email to the follow-up email in January with more detailed information, to the email coming from the head of schools office that talked about what the tuition rates were, to the confirmation email thanking people for and confirming their re-enrollment. So all of that, just like really any communication pieces that come out of the school, we worked really closely with the folks in the communications office. And then certainly the development office. So just making sure in terms of sort of a timeline that we're not sending the new tuition rate on the same day that the development office was planning on doing some solicitations and so forth. So just being smart about how often and what we're communicating to our current parents. So of course, with any new process, you learn a few things. Our words of wisdom after going through it the first time last year and entering that process this year now, in fact today is the day that we plan to send out our more detailed re-enrollment email to all the families that are eligible for re-enrollment. That you just make sure that you, if this makes sense for your school, that you seek some legal advice around the communication. So if you are moving from a paper or electronic paper or electronic enrollment contract to something that's more of an email message, like Cat and Gable, that what is contained in that email message is binding in the way that you want it to be. So we certainly had the school's lawyer take a look at the language and give us some advice on that. Also, just make sure that with any process, this is true, that you create a timeline that works for everybody. So make sure that you include what the needs are of the business office, the development office, and truly sort of anybody who has a stake in it. So we found that it was really helpful to just sort of work backwards from when we needed to know how many spaces were available for new students, so for when we sent out offers of admission for our new families, and then just work backwards from there. As I mentioned already, we think it's just really important to vet the entire process, including really sort of a sample email or whatever is most helpful to a select group of current parents, just to get their reaction or constructive criticism, and hopefully ultimately just act as advocates for the new process. Because of course the power of the parent community is huge in those schools. One very good lesson that we learned, unfortunately a little bit later in the process, is just to make sure that the communications office is involved with the messaging and the timeline from the very beginning. We got all excited about this process with the business office and with the IT office, and just sort of charged forward, and then at some point looped in the communication office folks, and it just would have been easier to just loop them in from the very beginning. So that was a good lesson to learn. We also learned after last year's process that it's worth the time and energy to send a confirmation of the deposit paid. So the deposit, of course, was billed on the January statement, but we still, because families weren't electronically or physically signing a re-enrollment contract for the very first time, there was a little bit of anxiety around, does this really mean my child is re-enrolled? Are you truly saving a spot for my child? So we somewhat spontaneously decided in February that it made sense to send a confirmation to those folks who paid their deposit, just so that they would know that yes, we are saving a spot for their child. So that was something we sort of added into the process a little bit late in the game. We also needed to think about, with a slightly more aggressive billing cycle, just thinking about brand new families coming into the school that may be making tuition payments both at their current school, if they're coming from a private school or a school that required tuition, as well as requiring them to begin their payments in the spring to Catlin. So just thinking about that and managing that in a way that seems respectful. We also, and this is something that we're still sort of working on, but ideally working toward having the next year's tuition rates confirmed by the Board of Trustees prior to sending out the customized or more detailed re-enrollment email that goes out in early January, versus sending out that customized email and then a week later, when the tuition has been confirmed, sending out a second email. So we're still working on that. The goal will be to send a single message after the new tuition rates were confirmed by the Board of Trustees. And then a really sort of simple message, but a really important thing to remember is just to make sure with such an automated process that we don't sort of lose that opportunity to just acknowledge the financial sacrifices that our parents and our families make to pay the to pay their tuition. So we make sure that in our confirmation that we do acknowledge that. We want to provide our contact information. Both Sarah Nordoff, the Director of Admission and Financial Aid, who spoke for the first part of the program, and my contact information, as the slide shows. We're happy to provide any kind of sample language around what we call our heads up message, which was the kind of quick message we sent via email in December, letting people know of the new process, as well as language around the more customized, detailed re-enrollment email that went out in early January last year, as well as the re-enrollment confirmation email that we sent last year after the deadline passed to pay the deposit. We're happy to send information or samples around the new student enrollment agreement that we now use. We also have language around the tuition confirmation email that came from our head of schools office. So we are absolutely happy to if anybody wants to email us and ask for any of those things, we are happy to send them your way. And that concludes our presentation portion.
Thank you so much, Mary and Sarah. We do have quite a few questions actually coming in. I want to encourage anyone who would like to have their question answered live to please send, to type it into the text box on your GoToWebinar control panel and send it in to me. Hopefully we can get to all of these. It was a nice quick presentation, so we'll have a nice robust Q&A at this point. Mary and Sarah, the first question is with regards to the customized emails. How are they created for each family? Is that used, do you use a software program for that? If so, which one? And Silvana would like to know if it's available in Canada, if you know that.
So we have Outlook as our email, and truly just used our regular email that we would send anything from, in terms of from Cat and Gable. We just used a sort of, we used mail merge. So there was certainly a fair amount of prep work in terms of making sure we had the right student name with the right grade that they would be rising to the next year, with the correct email address, and so on and so forth. So lots of prep work, but truly the email was relatively simple. I just had some email merge fields in it, but no special software was used.
Excellent, thank you. Julie is asking, are all the conditions and terms listed in the initial enrollment agreement, which was signed electronically, are they still legally binding even though they're not re-signing each year?
That was a conversation certainly that we had with the school's lawyer, and so the language that we use basically yes, says that that the sort of the policies and so forth are binding from year to year.
Great, thank you. Eric is asking if you could address the financial aid process year over year, I guess how it dovetails with this process.
So for families who are applying for financial aid, their deadline is a little bit later than our re-enrollment process. So we send out financial aid decisions to current families in early March. So we do have a part of the contract that indicates that if they're, if one reason is that they cannot re-enroll is due to the inability to afford the school, we would not hold them accountable for that contract. So there's a couple of reasons that we would allow a family to de-enroll without penalty, and certainly if financial aid is one of them, then that's fine. especially given that the process for knowing their financial decision is later than when their re-enrollment is due. Our deposit, though, the 10% deposit is typically based on their net tuition. So for families who received financial aid in the past, we base that deposit based on their financial aid award and how that impacted their net tuition for the previous year.
Excellent, thank you. What do you do with families who pay in full once a year?
So for families who pay in full, they can just, that's one of the tuition plans. We have 3 different tuition plans, I think. One is to pay in full, one is to pay in monthly installments over 10 months, and the other I think is to pay in 3 installments of like 30, 30, and 40, something like that. So families can certainly pay in full if that's the option that's best for them.
Great, thank you. We've had a couple of questions about the supporting slides for this presentation. I have asked Sarah and Mary to provide those to me, so I will post them on the same page as the webinar recording once that is ready to go. So, and if they have any other supporting documents that they'd like to provide to me, I will put them all on that same page. So yes, you will be able to get a copy of the slides and as well as the recording. Roland is asking how you set up the first contract, the first enrollment contract to be the one in place until they leave, until they exit the school.
So we have language in that contract that, again, we used EchoSign for families to sign that indicates that this is their contract for their tenure at the school. So we put it out there up front that what they're signing now, all of the policies and parameters around enrollment in good stead will be true for the years going forward that they're here, which was part of the legal advice that we received. So that's how, in part, we're able to hold families accountable to that one contract, is because of what we said to them up front.
Thank you.
We do have, I should add, Karen, we do have a page that Mary may have mentioned this. We have a lot of our enrollment parameters on web pages that we link to in our communications to families. So our lengthy contracts that we had going out, we've taken a lot of that language and put it on the web pages to remind families, you know, so if they've forgotten some of the parameters of remaining enrolled, that's in print on those pages and they can refer to them.
Great, thank you. And I've had a couple questions once again about that same process. So you send out an email to new families that contains this initial contract the first year after this whole re-enrollment process has completed. Is that correct?
Right. So our new enrollment goes out after our re-enrollment process wraps up. So new enrollment for Catlin happens in the first Friday of March. And so that's when we send out our initial contracts to new families. And then those families would receive the email going forward as a re-enrolling family.
I see. Thank you so much. We've had a couple of questions about forms, yearly forms that need to be filled out, medical forms, risk consent forms, photo releases, those things. How do you get those signed for the year?
We have done that a couple of different ways. So right now we have those embedded in our website. So for it's somewhat of an additional mailing that goes, emailing that goes to families. I think from the division heads actually now, that asks them to fill out the medical forms, and but it's all part of their sort of web profile that they can go in and change at any time. Their contact information, their emergency contacts, all of those sorts of things are part now of the family's web profile, and that comes to them later on in the spring. So it's not really part of the refreshment of re-enrollment as much as it is something that they refresh, hopefully on an ongoing basis as things change, but we prompt them to do so in the springtime.
Great, thank you. We had a question about the timeline of how this all works. That the email about the deposit goes out prior to confirming the next year's tuition rates, and then I'm wondering if you might be able to just briefly go over that timeline again.
In fact, I can pull it up here. So the timeline is that in early December, we send the heads up email to families that re-enrollment is coming around the bend, and to get ready for the email that will be coming to them in January that will be their formal re-enrollment contract / email. So then in early January, we send each family the customized email that has their payment plan and tuition insurance choices, and that asks them to let us know by February 1st whether or not they will be, to let us know by February 1st if they are not returning, since we're assuming that they are. And then right after that email goes out, the business office sends their billing statement that has their re-enrollment deposit within it, and that is due by February 1st. And then at this point, right after that, we send out families from the head of school what the tuition rates are for the next year because of that board meeting timing for us. In the future, we'd like to have one change for next year. Mary Mary talked about this too. We would like to have we'd like to have the tuition decided in December so that we could actually have some of this communication go out at the same time. So the re-enrollment contract and the tuition amounts are delivered to families right at the same time versus how we do it now. And it's not a long delay, but it's a few days, and so it would be a little cleaner to do it all at once. But that's the process. And then in early February, after the deadline has passed, we email families to let them know that indeed they are re-enrolled.
Excellent. Thank you so much. We had one more question regarding the software that you use for this process. I know that you mentioned this earlier in the webinar. If you could just please discuss the software program that you used and if you would recommend it for this process.
So when we went from a paper contract to an electronic contract, we decided to purchase DocuSign, D-O-C-U-S-I-G-N, I believe. And we used that for a couple of years, and while it worked fine, we did decide that when we were going to go to a more automated or assumed re-enrollment process that would involve a simple email for the current families to re-enroll, but still we wanted an electronic contract for brand new families as their initial contract. Since we were changing things up anyway, we decided to take another look around and ultimately decided to go with EchoSign. I would be happy if individuals wanted to email to ask a little bit more about the details on what went into that decision. That decision was sort of led by our IT folks. So honestly, I'm not quite sure of all the reasons why why we made the switch. But we've been relatively satisfied with EchoSign for our new student contracts. So at this point, anyway, we're planning to stay with them.
Great, thanks very much. We've had a couple of questions regarding the logistics for the very first year that you implemented this plan. So the families that did not receive the enrollment contract that stated that they would automatically be re-enrolled, how did you handle that with them in order to kind of get them on board?
So tell me again which families you're referring to?
So the families that enrolled, say, in April, and you decided to begin this program in November, the families who you already had enrolled that were not used to this automatic re-enrollment and had not received the enrollment agreement that contained that language, how did you broach this subject with them?
Yeah, so the first year that we decided to unveil the new automated or assumed re-enrollment process, we had a number of conversations around, oh, do we one last time send a new electronic contract that included language around from now on, this is what you will be held to and so forth. And ultimately, and it was certainly after lots of conversation and consulting the school's attorney, we ultimately decided that an email would suffice. We just decided to keep it simple. And again, I'm happy to provide that language to any schools who want it. But we kept it pretty simple and basically just told families that we are assuming that you are re-enrolling unless you let us know otherwise, and that you will have the re-enrollment deposit. You will see that on your January bill. And we just sort of moved forward from there, and that worked for us.
Karen, we also told those families that the contract that they had signed, that the parameters of that contract are holding true, that this email is confirming those parameters, so that legally we were covered in terms of the policies that were in the contracts. That we were saying to them in the email that you're still bound by that contract. And then now in the new contracts we're saying, you know, what you're signing now will hold true going forward. So we sort of did it, we shifted it the first year.
Okay, thank you so much for clarifying that. We had a question about, were there any problems from families who said that they never received the re-enrollment email, even if you had the right email address for them?
I don't think, we certainly anticipated that that may be the case, and it might be the result of just now all families being able to go to through a portal on our website to update their their email addresses and those kinds of things, and because the school's general practice is to send communication via email. I don't remember actually anybody coming back and saying, oh, I never got this. And because we no longer require sort of an action around anybody who's planning on returning the following year, the action is involved in terms of paying their deposit on their bill. That was our way of knowing. So if somebody didn't pay the deposit by the due date of February 1st, of course we waited a week or so, but then we did some follow-up with those families. And for the most part, though, there wasn't sort of a comment around we never got the email. It was more just around, it was just another conversation around why the deposit hadn't been paid yet. But there was sort of that action that was taken on the business office and the admission offices, and in terms of doing some follow-up on anybody who didn't pay the deposit by the deadline.
Excellent, thank you. We had one more question about the initial contract. Derek is asking if the initial contract included that year's tuition and payment plan option, or did that come in a separate document? They currently add the net tuition into their enrollment contract the families sign.
I believe so if you're talking about the new enrollment contract, or the enrollment contract that we used for new families last year, which was their one and only sort of enrollment agreement or contract, it did include what their payment options were, what the new tuition rates were. As Sarah mentioned, some of that was a link to a page on the website, and some of it was embedded in the electronic contract.
Excellent. Thank you so much. That's all the live questions that we have for today. I want to thank our audience for tuning in, and a special thank you to Sarah and Mary for providing us with this insightful webinar. Just a reminder, a recording of this presentation as well as the slides will be made available on the webinar page in the professional development section on admission.org. Thanks again, and have a wonderful day.